This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Human Action Podcast. This episode, I'm going to be going through a recent Wired video where the host was Christopher Clark, who's an economist. Then the topic was the economics behind the Great Depression. And Jonathan Newman, actually, I want to give him credit. He sent me this video and said, hey, there's a lot of good fodder here. And indeed there is. Now, I should say, you don't need to be watching the video. We are going to put up some diagrams near the end and some of my responses. But also, you may want to tune into the video version of this because this guy Clark's beard game is just, I haven't seen anything like it, at least since Menger. So anyway, I would point you to that. Having said all that, there was a lot of stuff he'd said in this video that I think is either misleading or, leaves stuff out or is just flat out false. And, some of it I was kind of surprised. Okay, so what we're going to do is I've got 5 clips for you folks just to pace yourselves. So I will try to keep these responses snappy just to provide fodder for you. You're with the relatives and I guess this is probably dropping after Thanksgiving, but maybe you'll still be in touch with them or maybe you'll still be on vacation and you can go bring the stuff up to them. It'd be good fodder. Okay, so, before I dive into this last thing, I'm going to just give you sort of a teaser here on some of the Austrian / libertarian responses on some of these issues. If you want to see more, Murray Rothbard has a book, America's Great Depression, which is great. However, that mostly covers the 20s and what caused the unsustainable boom that led to the 29 crash from an Austrian perspective. And then the Hoover administration's response. It doesn't really get into the New Deal. I have a book in the Politically Incorrect Guide series on the Great Depression and the New Deal, which, as the name suggests, does cover that stuff. But also the work of Robert Higgs is really good on the claim that, did World War II get us out of the Depression, right? So at the end of this video, I will touch on some of the specific points that Higgs brought to the attention of the profession, in scholarly articles. But anyway, I just wanted to point you to further reading if you do want to dive into this stuff more. Okay, so let's get right into it. This first clip, he is going to explain why did the Great Depression start.
Bright Sherbet asks, explain it like I'm 5. What caused the Great Depression between 1929 and 1933? In the late 1920s, the United States financial markets were experiencing a speculative boom. Now, the real economy was growing and there were real profits to be shared on Wall Street, but they started investing heavily on margins. Now, what this means is that they would take out huge loans and then buy stocks with those loans. And then they would set up a different company to buy stocks in that company, again on huge loans. So that meant an initial investment of, say, $100 could turn into $1,000 worth of stock. So any rise in the stock would be a huge boom, but any speculative boom is eventually going to end. The economy hit a run-of-the-mill recession in the summer of 1929. The slowdown in economic activity led the market to peak on September 3rd. But because so many of these stocks were not held outright, but by loan, any fall in the price meant a cascading chain of everyone calling in their loans, which meant by October, we experienced a huge crash. Here's a picture of Wall Street on the corner of Wall Street and Broad, showing the crowds all worried about their falling fortunes. Now, despite what everyone thinks, the stock market is not the economy. Only 1% to 2% of Americans at the time held any stock. This event could have primarily just affected folks in New York and other financial markets. How did it start affecting the rest of the economy? A falling stock market means there's less wealth in the economy. Less wealth means less consumption. Businesses can't move goods. They're not able to hire people. They gotta let others go. Things start cascading into the real world once we start seeing massive bank failures. You see, if a bank loses a lot of their stock, they're not going to be able to honor folks who put their deposits in. This is how a bank works. You come along, you put your money in the bank, they take it, and then they lend it out to other people. But if those loans aren't being paid back, then the bank can't pay their depositors back, which means you as a depositor are only going to get there if you're first. And how do you get there first? You got to be the number one person in that line. If you're too far back, the banks ran out of cash and they're not going to be able to pay you back. The bank doesn't have any loans available because the people who owe them money are now going bankrupt. And so banks are starting to fail. It's not just one or two banks here and there, it's 10,000 banks that are collapsing across these years. One of the reasons is because all these banks are forced to be really small. So if you get a modest shock, they don't have the resources to insure themselves or to draw on other regions. Surprisingly, just north of the border, Canada only had 10 banks served the entire country, and they didn't experience runs. This was unique to the United States and our fractured banking system.
Okay, so the problem with blaming sort of like, oh, lax regulation and there was margin lending and things like that is, and I've used this analogy before, so forgive me, folks, if you've heard me make it, but it's kind of like there's a plane crash and then the investigators go in and they do their research and whatnot, and they come back and people say, oh, so why did that plane crash? And they say, oh, because of gravity, right? That's not a good explanation. Now, it's involved, right? But the point is, why is that not a good explanation? Is because gravity applies to lots of other planes that didn't crash. So you're trying to explain what went wrong with this flight to just say gravity doesn't really work. And so likewise, when we're trying to understand why did the financial crisis that, blew up in 1929 then lead to the worst decade of economic performance in U.S. history, both up to that point and, it has not been surpassed since then, to say, oh, because in the 20s, the mid to late 20s, they didn't have the SEC and they didn't have, Glass-Steagall in place and they didn't have all these regulations and limits on margin lending and stuff that we take for granted now. It was just unregulated wildcat capitalism. Okay, but that was also true in all of the earlier financial panics or depressions with a small d. All right, so if you're not aware, in U.S. economic history, there were several depressions, and that was the word they used, that had happened before the Great Depression. Okay, so the question is, how come those didn't turn into what we now think of as the worst one ever? All right, so again, just to say because there was lax regulation going into it that caused this speculative bubble, that really doesn't explain much. I will say what could kind of go along towards an explanation is that the Federal Reserve was in place during the 20s that could possibly have been fueling the speculative boom that would not have been true for earlier ones, right? So if we're trying to understand, like if the explanation is for some reason the boom in the 20s was just a lot bigger and less sustainable or, more fundamentally unsound than all prior ones, what accounted for the difference? Again, it's not that before they had really tight regulation and then Calvin Coolidge stripped all that away or something in the 20s. That's not what's going on. Okay. But again, what conceivably could make sense is to say that the central bank was now up and running. It had fueled, the boom during World War I and so on, right? You could say that. Also, he kind of had it as a throwaway line there, but in terms of all the massive bank failures, and he said because the banks were not allowed to, have large-scale chains or so. I forget the exact wording he used, or they were forced to remain small. But he didn't really elaborate on that. That was government regulation, right? They had what were called unit banking regulations. Okay, so in Canada, there were just a few major banks in terms of like the companies that could have branches all over the country. And so the idea was, if a bunch of farmers in a certain region had taken out loans and then their crops failed and they defaulted, it's not that the whole bank went down, just, that area, those loans were not performing, but the bank had loans all over the country. And so those could cushion the blow. All right. Whereas in the United States, that was not the case. You did not have giant banks that had branches in all the different states. That wasn't legally allowed. And so that's what made, if each bank now is just confined to a particular state and they can't spread that portfolio, as it were, geographically around the whole country, well then, local problems then get exacerbated, right? So that's one of the reasons that the U.S. banking system was so much more fragile and had thousands of bank failures in the early 30s, whereas as Clark said there, Canada didn't have a similar experience with their banks. All right. But you might have just thought that was something peculiar to, oh yeah, capitalism run amok in the U.S. No, it was because of government regulations. That's why that was the situation. All right. Let's now go to the familiar claim that, oh yeah, the do-nothing Herbert Hoover was the reason this happened. So here we go.
A Reddit user asks, how much did Herbert Hoover's policies contribute to the Great Depression? President Hoover largely didn't do much, and it was somewhat against his instinct. On his path to the presidency, he served in the post-World War I Reconstruction. He was a humanitarian, he was an engineer, and he wanted the best for the country. His advisor, Andrew Mellon, told him that recessions are healthy and necessary in an economy. They cut out the fat. If you're a business that has a bad model, a recession cleans it out so we can use our resources more effectively. After the Depression, Hoover, in his memoirs, lambasted that previous view and completely regretted his lack of action. He complained that Mellon simply wanted to liquidate labor, liquidate investment, liquidate Wall Street, liquidate everything, and clearly you can't liquidate an entire economy. This sets up a debate. Still today, there is a split between economists on how much should the government get involved in a depression. But Hoover wasn't entirely actionless. He brought in folks from industry and he pled with them to keep wages high. There are some economists who think that this effort to keep wages at a high level prevented the economy from self-correcting, that it encouraged monopoly practices and that distorted the market, slowing it down even further.
Okay, so again, in general, to say why did the Great Depression happen when it did, and the answer being, oh, because Herbert Hoover sat back and did nothing. Like maybe he meant well, but geez, he just had these qualms, oh, this whole Constitution's tied in my hands, what can I do? That doesn't really work because prior U.S. presidents, during their associated financial panics or depressions with a small d, they also didn't implement a New Deal. They didn't have fireside chats and whatnot, all the things that we think FDR did, that finally somebody gets in there and rolls his sleeves up to take care of this problem, that was also lacking during prior administrations. So to explain what was it that made the Great Depression great, in the bad sense, it doesn't really work to say, oh, because the U.S. federal government didn't do much to try to fight it. Okay? Beyond that, though, we can say a lot more. And this was the clip where I was really surprised that I think, Chris Clark here, he didn't merely leave certain things out or say something, without telling the full story or whatever. But here, I think what he said was actively misleading. Okay. Now, I'm not accusing him of deliberate deception, but let me just show you what I'm talking about. So from his commentary there, you would have thought that Herbert Hoover in his memoirs was saying, when the stock market crashed, the Secretary of the Treasury Mellon came to us in the cabinet meeting and he said, hey, we should just liquidate everything. And that's the medicine for the economy right now. I know it's going to be painful for some, but we just got to hit rock bottom. And I went along with it. But, now looking back years later, I wish I had pushed back more. I wish we had intervened and tried to have the federal government do something to help people back then. Right? That's what you would have thought. And no, that's not at all. It's A, not what Hoover said in his memoirs, and I'm going to read it to you in a second, and B, objectively, Hoover didn't, quote, do nothing. Okay? So here, let me just first establish the point of what did he write in his memoirs. So in the part, and people cite this a lot, to try to blame the Hoover administration for, being this right-wing Republican do-nothing regime as opposed to, the interventionist activist FDR who wanted to go in there and use the power of the government to help the poor people. So Hoover, in his memoirs, years later, writing about this period, says after the stock market crash, this is what he says. Two schools of thought quickly developed within our administration discussions. First was the leave it alone liquidationists headed by my Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon, who felt the government must keep its hands off the economy and let the slump liquidate itself. Okay, now, people often stop the quotations there, but then Hoover goes on to say, but other members of the administration also having economic responsibilities under Secretary of the Treasury Mills, Governor Young of the Reserve Board, Secretary of Commerce Lamont, and Secretary of Agriculture Hyde, believed with me that we should use the powers of government to cushion the situation. Okay, so this famous smoking gun that people point to from Hoover's memoirs, in which they say, Hoover's Secretary of the Treasury Mellon advocated liquidate stock, liquidate labor, liquidate real estate, and they were just going to let the economy find its rock bottom, and that's a terrible strategy. The only reason we even know that that was what Mellon said is because Hoover was paraphrasing that in his memoirs and said, we didn't listen to him. Others in mind, there were two schools of thought. Some people agreed with what Mellon was saying. Other people said, no, we should use the power of government to help, including me, and that's what we did. Okay, so it's incredible to me because, and I'm not just mad at this Clark guy. Like Brad DeLong has said this before, and I went after him at the time. I mean, so this comes up a lot where people accuse Hoover of heeding the advice and following this strategy of liquidationism, when again, the only reason we even know about that is because Hoover was throwing Mellon under the bus to say, people blame me for the Great Depression, but I mean, look, we did everything we could. We didn't listen to this nut job, Andrew Mellon. Okay, so that's where that stands. And then you could say, okay, maybe Hoover later, since it didn't work out, is trying to cover his butt. And no, they were not. The Hoover administration was the most interventionist into the economy during peacetime in U.S. history up to that point. So it's true, when FDR comes in after him, they did more. But it's not that they did things that were qualitatively different. They just turned up the dial. All right. And in fact, one of FDR's chief lieutenants of the New Deal later on in the 30s, I'm paraphrasing, but this is close to the quote, said something like, yeah, we never would have admitted it at the time, but much of what we did during the New Deal simply elaborated upon what Hoover did in his administration. Okay, so there were all kinds of public spending. Again, it was not just the quantity, but also the quality, like the types of things the federal government did under the Hoover administration was unprecedented. All right, in terms of just absolute levels, you can flash up a shot here. So what this is showing is federal spending broken down by fiscal year in billions of dollars. And so you can see from 28 to 29, that fiscal year, it was about $3 billion. And then it goes up a little bit the next year. And then it goes up even more to about 3.5. I'm just eyeballing the chart here in 30, 31. And then in the 31 to 32 fiscal year, it's about eyeballing about 4.8 billion. Okay. So this is a large percentage increase in total federal spending going into the depths of the Great Depression while the money supply is contracting by a third. Okay, so in real terms, inflation-adjusted terms, because prices are falling, this is an even bigger increase in federal spending. And then also, if you want to say, well, what about, were they willing to borrow money and deficit spend? Yeah, they went in the beginning, there was a slight surplus. And then you could see in the 30-31 that flipped to a deficit. And then in the 31-32 fiscal year, the federal deficit was 4% of GDP. Okay, so it got bigger under FDR. But again, this idea that Hoover sat back and did nothing and was just trying to balance the budget is not correct. Okay. Also, Clark there, he mentioned the issue of Hoover trying to prop up wage rates, but he didn't really nail down exactly why that was so destructive. So here, Richard Vedder and Galloway have done great empirical work on this. But among other things, what happened is after the 29 crash, Herbert Hoover calls in like the big leaders from big business and the labor unions and says, look, at what I absolutely do not want you to do in response to this financial crisis now is to start cutting wage rates, right? Like, because Hoover had this theory based on his study of past economic depressions with a small d, that he thought the problem was, when there's a financial shock, the households clam up. They try to they try to cut out superfluous spending. They want to save more. That makes sense. It's rational for an individual household. The businesses, likewise, they try to really tighten their belts and they try to, negotiate wage reductions with their workforce and say, hey, times are tough right now, so we got to cut your pay. And then the problem is there's just this downward spiral that prices are, because this is back in the day when during a boom, prices would rise, but then during a bust, prices would actually fall, perhaps significantly, right? In our times, we don't usually see that. We're used to just prices are always going up. It's just a question of, are they going to go up a lot or a little bit? But back then, it was like during a boom, prices went up, and then during a bust, prices went down. Because on the hard gold standard, things were, the purchasing power of money was constant over long stretches. Okay. And so Hoover thought, we got to break out of this cycle, because the problem is when the businesses cut workers' pay, thinking they're being smart and trying to just stay lean and mean, now the workers don't have as much money in their pockets, so they can't spend as much on products and services. And so now the business's revenue goes down again. And what do? They cut wages again because, hey, sales have fallen off. And so Hoover thought it was this downward spiral, this race to the bottom. And he said, let's just nip that in the bud. And so again, he called in all the big business leaders and labor unions and said, I want you to keep money wage rates constant. Do not cut them, because we'll as long as the workers have enough purchasing power to buy the products, it'll, prop up employment. That's what he said. So he was just wrong. That was a faulty economic theory, but that's what he believed, and that's what he told them. And they used the power of the government. It wasn't just, him asking pretty please. They used various government policies to try to incentivize them to heed that. So whatever methods, carrots and sticks they used, empirically, it is undeniable that wages were, quote, stickier in 1930 than they had been in earlier periods of U.S. history. So in particular, the 1920 and 21 Depression, and I'll put a link in the show notes page, folks, to that, where I have an article called The Depression You've Never Heard of. And I show by various metrics in 1920 and 21, there was a depression, and there, CPI fell faster in a 12-month period there than in any 12-month stretch during the Great Depression. Okay, so the idea that, the problem with the Great Depression was deflation. Well, no, deflation was worse in terms of, the 1-year drop back in the 2021 Depression. And that didn't lead to the 20s being awful. It was the roaring 20s. All right. The Fed was much tighter. The Fed raised rates to record highs in 2021. They cut rates to record lows between 29 and 33. Okay. So the Fed, by other metrics, the Fed contracted in 2021. The Fed expanded in 29 to 33. What I'm saying might surprise you because, I thought the Fed was really tight. And no, that's not what happened. I'll talk about that. I'll just go ahead and elaborate on that right now. Clark does come to it, but it's really not worth playing. But what happened is, yes, there were a bunch of bank failures in the late 29 through 33. And so the money supply, broadly construed, shrank. That's true because of the fractional reserve banking system, right? If people are pulling their money out of the banks, like if $100 in cash in the vault is supporting $400 in total checking account balances by members of the community, and then someone takes the 100 out in cash because they want it because they're afraid that the bank's going to fail, well, now the bank has to call in those loans and whatnot. So there's a sense in which $300 gets destroyed, if you think of it like that. Okay, so while that was going on, the Fed was expanding the monetary base. There were more $100 bills, if you want to think of it that way. But the point is, the Fed didn't inflate enough to fully offset the contraction to the broad money supply that was happening in the private banks. Okay, so that's partly what was going on there. All right, so the Fed was not adopting a tight money policy. It's just they did not open the monetary spigots enough to fully offset what was happening because people were panicked and pulling their money out of the banks. All right. But my point being, under various metrics, the things that people say were the explanation for why the 29 stock market crash ended up spawning the Great Depression, this decade of despair economically, a lot of those bullet points were worse in the 2021 depression. And yet the U.S. hit rock bottom real fast and then had a robust recovery that we call the Roaring 20s. Okay, so I want to say for a lot of those things, and again, the reason back then the government didn't do all the stuff that like the Hoover administration did, right? So just to finish that train of thought, so what's happening, just as prices in general are falling rapidly, right, because the overall quantity of money is shrinking, is right when the Hoover administration is propping up money wage rates, right? So like the number of dollars per hour that workers are getting paid doesn't shrink, doesn't fall. Wages all of a sudden become, quote, sticky. And so that's a recipe for disaster, right? Workers every year in the early 30s kept getting more and more expensive in real terms and inflation-adjusted terms because the goods and services they were helping create, the amount that their employers could sell them for in the marketplace kept falling. And yet they were supposed to keep paying the workers the same hourly amount measured in dollars. So that meant the workers kept getting more and more expensive. So as the economy is shrinking and workers are getting more and more expensive, what are you going to do as an employer? You're going to hire fewer workers. You're going to let people go. And so that's why unemployment went up to 25% by 32. Okay. So again, Clark, alluded to that a little bit, but he didn't really spell out just how disastrous that was. So again, the issue was not, Hoover just sat back and did nothing. If only he had. But no, he did a lot. Okay. Also, it is true that they tried, having large, increased government spending, and they let the deficit grow. But then they got nervous and thought, okay, we got to rein the deficit, and they had massive tax hikes in 1932, like massive tax hikes. And so, yes, that doesn't help the economy when it's on the ropes also. But for me, that the lesson there is not, they weren't engaged in Keynesian pump priming. That's counter-cyclical to raise it. The explanation is, when the economy is in free fall, the last thing you want to do is impose massive tax hikes. That's not embarrassing for the Austrian to admit that Herbert Hoover did that and that helped contribute to the awful economy. Okay. Here's a little bit on the role of the gold standard.
I Heart Alpacas asks, what role did being on the gold standard play during the Great Depression? Everything. Monetary policy is one of the primary tools we have to help recessions. And Hoover and initially FDR did not want to get off the gold standard. The gold standard at the time said 1 ounce of gold could be purchased for $20, and that price could not fluctuate. And the way to maintain that is to have a certain quantity of gold on hand. So if the value of the gold changed, then the central bank can buy and sell gold to maintain that dollar peg. But the problem is this is going to tie your hands to respond to an economic crisis. Nobel Prize economist Milton Friedman and his co-author Anna Schwartz published this book, The Monetary History of the United States, and it was monumental. It argued that the Great Depression was largely the fault of the central bank, in part trying to hold on to that gold standard. The total demand in the United States economy was collapsing. Prices were falling. This meant that businesses couldn't pay back their loans, which meant you saw more and more bank collapses, which in turn would put more businesses out of line and decline more and more wealth. If you allow the currency to change, if you get off the gold standard, in other words, you allow the central bank to print money, that's going to increase the amount of cash in the economy. That's going to make it so the banks can stay open. That's going to allow the economy to start growing again. This is such a big deal that as we see, when each country got off the gold standard, their depression stopped and growth returned. The first to do this was Scandinavia way back in 30 and 31. And then Great Britain did it in 1931. The United States and Germany, we did it in 1933. And then finally, France waited all the way to 37 before their economy started recovering.
Okay, again, just being a broken record here, going back to right after the formation, the Constitution comes in the new republic in its current version. The Coinage Act of 1792 defined the U.S. dollar as a certain amount in terms of grains of gold and silver. Okay, so to say, why did the 29 stock market crash then was followed by a wave of bank failures, and then we had the worst decade in economic history for the U.S. and the globe? Why? Oh, because of the gold standard. That doesn't make any sense. The gold standard had been in operation for centuries. Okay, I'll give you a little bit more of a hint. All the belligerents except the U.S. totally went off the gold standard in World War I and printed up a bunch of currency, and then they came back through half-hearted measures during the 20s because they didn't want to bite the bullet and just allow the massive deflation that would be necessary to go back to pre-war parity, and they didn't want to suffer the embarrassment of just revaluing their currency and say, yeah, we printed up a bunch in that horrible war, and so let's just acknowledge reality and tie our currency back to gold, but now at a more reasonable rate because we've printed so much. They didn't want to do that either. And yes, that half-hearted attempt to return to a pseudo-gold standard in the 20s didn't work. And eventually they threw in the towel, one country after another through the 30s. And yes, that quote helped, but again, it was illusory. Okay. And notice too, like he was saying, when some of the countries went off, like those are happening, except for France, all in the early 30s. Oh, so is that why the history books all say the Great Depression ended in 1933 for every country except France? No, that's not what the history books say. So again, this idea that, all they had to do was abandon gold and then everything was fixed, that's obviously not true. And so yes, again, as an Austrian, it doesn't embarrass me. I don't have to make excuses for the fact that if central banks print a bunch of money, that can give a temporary period of illusory prosperity, or if you're starting already in the midst of an awful economy, printing a bunch of money might fool people into thinking a recovery is underway, but it's not sustainable. You're literally just papering over the problems. And that's why, it didn't get us out of the Depression, did it? Okay, so, I've used this analogy before, but if I owe people a bunch of money, and then I say, the problem is this peg to the dollar. Like I owe all these creditors $100,000. The problem is this fixed definition of what a dollar is. If I could just print up Murphy notes that have a value of only 50 cents to the dollar, that would ease my debt burden. That would really raise my standard. Wow, I would experience a recovery. I would really prefer that rather than have to chafe under this fixed definition of a full-bodied dollar in terms of my debts. Yeah, so if the U.S. is just allowed to say, how we owe a bunch of dollars to people when it was defined as an ounce of gold was $20.67 an ounce. What if instead we could just redefine it and say now it's $35 an ounce for gold? Then wouldn't that make things easier? Well, yeah, but that's because you're doing a partial default. All right. Okay, and then the last myth, of course, has to do with World War II. So let's go ahead and play that.
Breath 1100 asks, was World War II really what ended the Great Depression? The economics of war is bad. War is bad for your economy. The reason the US did so well in World War II is basically because the fighting didn't happen here. But you look at Europe, and they collapsed. They had 2 giant civil wars during the first half of the 20th century. Not good for their economy. It's a whole lot better to build houses, to build businesses, than it is to build weapons and bombs. On the other hand, World War II gave a reason for the government to increase their spending at levels that they hadn't seen ever in the history of the country. And they did this through deficit spending. That means through borrowing. This is a relatively new idea. Under Hoover and under FDR, they originally wanted to balance the budget. John Maynard Keynes was an economist back in England, and he is the most influential economist in the 1920s. The modern study of macroeconomics basically can get its start looking at this guy. When he published his book, his General Theory, in 1936, and from his writings that he had been doing in the years previous, he said, During a recession, the government needs to step in and be the spender of last resort. And in his world, it didn't matter what you spent on, anything is better than nothing. This position has largely been dominant in the years since. Every time the economy experiences a recession, the government is going to increase its deficit spending. During COVID, we spent $5 trillion to make sure that folks were taken care of. And they were. The amount of economic suffering we had in the 2020 recession was a fraction of what we saw just previously. Studying macroeconomics and learning how to prevent catastrophes like recessions and massive depressions is one of the most important things we can do. We want to prevent economic suffering. We want to encourage prosperity for everyone.
Okay, so I was actually pleasantly surprised by Clark's response there, that he did stress the truisms that diverting your resources away from making cars and radios and nylon stockings and houses and into making battleships and munitions and things like that is prima facie not good for your standard of living. Like, if you need to do it to stave off a military disaster, okay, fair enough. But the idea is you're actually not making your people richer in material terms by engaging in war production, right? That's at best a necessary evil. Okay, so I'm glad. And then also, even more so, to engage in massive war and to blow other people and have your workers going overseas and getting slaughtered, that's certainly not good for your economy that was already on the ropes in terms of the Great Depression. So the idea that, could the outbreak of a world war fix what was ailing all the economies of the world? That no, prima facie, that's nuts. That's not right. Okay? But he didn't really get into some of the revisionist work that, again, Robert Higgs has done some pioneering efforts on this genre. So let me just mention a few points he's made. So one thing is, Higgs pointed out that you can look at the official unemployment rate and then just see how, it bounced up and down. It wasn't ever as high as 25% as it was in the depths under Herbert Hoover, but it still kept bouncing up into the double digits during the New Deal, right? So it was clear that the New Deal, and also clear that devaluing the dollar vis-a-vis gold didn't solve the problem. And then you only see unemployment come way down in terms of the official statistics once the U.S. goes into the war effort, right? But Higgs points out that, just think about it. You've got a bunch of unemployed people, and then when the war breaks out, they start drafting men, taking them and sending them overseas. So even if it were 1 for 1, it's not obvious that you're really solving the problem by doing that, right? But the thing is, it wasn't even 1 for 1, right? In other words, Higgs just shows the numbers, and that the reduction in the amount of unemployed men, going from 38 to 42 or whatever, the expansion of the men in the armed forces was bigger than the drop in the number of unemployed. Okay, so it wasn't even a 1 for 1 swap. So just in terms of that's a very costly way to, quote, solve the unemployment problem, right? Beyond that, even using the official statistics, we'll go ahead and flash this up, that, you can see that real GDP, according to the official data series that the government maintains, it shrank significantly in the early 30s, and then it recovered up, and then it came down a little bit, the 37, 38 double dip, but then it really just zooms up in the early to mid 40s with, the U.S. getting into the war. But part of the problem here is real GDP just naively includes government spending. And so if you disaggregate the data, which we've done here, right, where the green now is showing the government share of GDP and the blue is the private sector share. And these are the official numbers, right? This isn't me using a Rothbardian metric or something. This is the government's own figures. You can see that in the depths of World War II, the total amount of real GDP in the private sector was lower than it had been in the worst depths of the Great Depression under Hoover. And this is, more than a decade later. And the population's bigger. right? So per capita real GDP is way lower at this point. Okay, so there's that element. So again, I'm showing it's not that, oh yeah, the depression was bad and it kept lingering, and then the war finally just jump-started the economy, and then we had prosperity again. That no, on the home front, the privation in 43, 44 was even worse than it had been in 32 in terms of the amount of real goods and services getting distributed to people in the private sector. Okay, again, according to the government's own statistics. And there's one more element to all this that Higgs pointed out, because you could say, well, yeah, but still, because they had to pivot away from making cars. They had to make battleships and aircraft carriers and tanks and bullets and combat boots and whatnot. And so that took real resources or whatever, but people were fully employed. And yes, they knew they had to go without, and they had to skip meat and stuff like that. And the women had to just let their stockings get holes in them and things. But there was a war on, there's this common unity, and people understood, okay. But beyond that element, in terms of like the distribution and like the war machine gobbling up all the resources and not leaving only crumbs for the private sector, besides that, there's another fraud going on with these official GDP statistics. So in principle, these things are real GDP. They account for inflation. But as Higgs pointed out in his work, what happened when the U.S. government, fully goes into the war effort? They run up massive budget deficits. And the Federal Reserve was instructed to monetize those deficits, right? So the Federal Reserve printed money in order to buy government bonds. Because if the government just went to the private sector without being aided by the central bank, right? If the total quantity of base US dollars just stayed the same, or was normal, and you wouldn't have realized from looking at the Fed's data that there was a war going on, then the amount of money that the US federal government spent on the war effort, they couldn't have raised it just from taxes, and they couldn't have even raised it by turning to the bond markets and floating more treasuries without the Fed coming in and assisting. Okay, or another way you could put it is the Fed ran the printing press to keep interest rates from spiking too much, given how much the federal government wanted to borrow. Okay, so normally, if the Fed is just going to open up the monetary spigots to assist with government deficit spending, you would see prices rise, right? And so then if you're looking at the ostensibly real GDP statistics, what are you supposed to do? You look at nominal GDP, right? What's total spending on finished final goods and services, just measured purely in monetary terms. But hey, if that doubles, like let's just say the Fed doubles the money supply, and just assume naively all prices double. Okay? So spending patterns remain the same, nominal GDP would double. But when you say what happened to real GDP, you would say, oh, well, look at a basket of consumer goods and we'll see what happened to those. And so, like I said, if everything just simplistically assumed doubled, then the basket of those consumer goods would also double. And so when you go to calculate real GDP, you'd say, oh, nominal expenditures doubled, but the relevant price level also doubled. And so real GDP remained unchanged. Okay? So that's the way you would do it. So, and that kind of makes sense, right? That the Fed just printing money per se, shouldn't all of a sudden goose the statistics and make it look like real output went up. Okay? But in the World War II period here, what happened? The Fed opened up the monetary spigots that helped the federal government spend boatloads of more extra money, and that would have pushed up prices. But guess what? They imposed wage and price controls. It was illegal for merchants to raise prices in accordance with the new laws of supply and demand and what the market would bear. And so the point is, these real GDP series are bogus because they're showing the increase in nominal expenditures aided and abetted by the Fed creating new base money in this period, but they don't allow the natural market reaction of the prices shooting up to offset that when you go to calculate the real version of the statistics. And so when I read this argument from Higgs, I emailed him and I said, hang on, are you saying that they did adjust for the wage and price controls, but you don't think they adjusted properly? Like they underestimated that effect? Or are you saying they didn't adjust for that whatsoever? And he answered and said, they didn't adjust for that whatsoever. All right. So another way of seeing it is there were lots of shortages during this period, right? And they had ration cards and, this kind of stuff. And so there were other ways that the monetary inflation impaired consumer satisfaction that were not reflected just with skyrocketing prices on the stickers. Okay. But that was all swept under the rug in terms of these official statistics because the government just said, no, it's illegal. You can't raise prices and wages. Or, there were strict limits on how rapidly they could rise. Okay. So again, when people say, oh, World War II solved the Depression because it finally gave the government the ability to deficit spend the way Keynes would have wanted, that is not at all, the data don't show that. And you can think it through. If it sounds crazy to you, how could letting the government channel real resources into very destructive things, how does that make us richer? It doesn't. Okay. And the various data sets that ostensibly show otherwise, there are serious problems with, as Robert Higgs has demonstrated better than anybody else. Okay. Well, that's a good spot to wrap up. Thanks everybody for your attention. Again, check out Rothbard's America's Great Depression, my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression New Deal. And Robert Higgs is he's got a lot of this in his Crisis and Leviathan, and he's also got other books. If you just browse his catalog, things about, on the Great Depression and war and such. So it's all his good stuff is in there. Okay. See you next time, folks.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.